VT Rocks. My guest today is Ed Stanak. Ed is a recovering bureaucrat and an activist. It's a wonderful combination. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And we're going to talk about Act 250.
Yes.
Tell me about Act 250.
Well, Act 250, many people believe it's many things, but
Yeah.
Act 250 is a law which was passed in 1969 when we had a Republican governor and a completely Republican legislature. And they decided they could look down the road and see that with the expansions of ski areas and big money coming to Vermont to buy second homes, and with the completion of the interstates, there was going to be profound changes in Vermont. At that time, most Vermont towns did not even have sewerage ordinances, let alone
Right.
zoning. So they passed Act 250, and Act 250 has two primary goals. One, to ensure quality development and subdivision of land, and secondly, to protect finite natural resources, such as wildlife habitat, prime ag soils, stuff like that.
Right.
So it passed in 1969 and took effect in 1970.
Has it been modified along the way?
Oh, it has been modified many times over the years, yes. Yep.
I know there's a lot of questions being asked about it right now, and that there's a belief from your average person on the street, like me,
Right.
that Act 250 is limiting us from being able to do things with our own homes and our own lands.
Right.
But it's more than that, right?
Actually, it's more and it's less than that.
Okay.
I begin by saying, the fancy word, do I need to get a permit? The fancy word is jurisdiction. What does Act 250 have jurisdiction over? And making a long story short, it's two categories. One, if you're going to do something and build for commercial or industrial purposes, you need to get a permit.
Right.
If you're going to subdivide land, 10 or more lots over 5 years, or in towns without zoning, 6 or more lots in 5 years. So in those two examples, you need to get an Act 250 permit. Flipping the coin around, a lot of people in Vermont are totally mistaken. By golly, if I need to get a permit to do something, it's Act 250. So I can't tell you how many times when I worked for the state, I would get a phone call, people upset about their Act 250 permit. And when you peel back the layers in the onion, it was either a zoning permit they were upset about, or it was a permit from the Agency of Natural Resources for a septic system. But most of the time it was an Act 250. In fact, 90% of Vermonters will never, ever have to go through Act 250. So all those permits out there, most of them, not Act 250.
So let me take a wild guess here. So a lot of the concern and the complaining about Act 250 comes from big corporations?
Yeah, I think it's at least two reasons. One, the state really dropped the ball miserably in not doing public education, which is amazing. Act 250 has been around for 50 years and no education. A long time ago, I taught school. So when I became a bureaucrat, I said, we should do prepackaged curriculum for the high schools because all these kids are someday going to be people that are going to be buying property and stuff, so let's educate them. But
it's a really good idea.
That's right. But from the negative point of view, what happened was a lot of what you could call the special interest decided to really get out in front of this and put bad spin on Act 250. And, I think the word is correct. I always use the word propaganda, and not to offend anyone, but, the State Chamber of Commerce is a good example. For years, they've been cranking out all sorts of misinformation about Act 250. It's the never-ending process. It's delay, delay, delay. It's extremely bad for the economy. All this stuff, which, when, again, you drill down into the facts, really isn't true.
Act 250 allows public comment, isn't that true?
Public participation. In fact, I'm glad you brought that point up because the companion agency that issues technical permits, the Agency of Natural Resources, allows for public comments. But that's a world of difference from actual participation. So Act 250 does allow public participation. The neighbor, the citizens group, the town select board and planning commission are on totally equal footing with the biggest development corporation in the world. So there is this tremendous tool of public participation.
Yeah, I've had two connections with Act 250, one of which was around the landfill and its attempt to expand.
Yes.
And the other was around what was going to be ANC Bio, which was a scam.
Right.
But
This is the hole in downtown, isn't it?
Well, that's part of it,
Okay.
but ANC Bio is the old Bogner factory that was going to become a sort of medical equipment virus developing center. It was crazy
Wow.
stuff, but we, the locals, were allowed to participate in that, and we were amazed that they gave us equal weight in the conversation.
Yeah.
The Act 250 that we participated in around the landfill, that was sort of way at the end because there'd been so little publicity about that ahead of time.
Right.
And we didn't win in terms of preventing the expansion, but we did at least get leachate stopped being discharged into the watershed.
Yes.
And we were, as a group, were very grateful to Act 250 then. So
Yeah.
as I've been reading the stuff about getting rid of it, it's sort of, oh no,
Right.
because that will open the door
Yeah.
for a lot of other
Right.
nasty things to come in.
That's right. Yep. Yeah, Act 250 with respect to the landfill, that case you're talking about was
Yeah.
around 2018, as I
Yes.
recall. And it was a good example because one of the things that Republican governor and that Republican legislature in 1969 baked into Act 250 was an oversight function. They wanted these citizen panels of 3 members. The state's divided into 9 districts, and each of these districts has a commission of 3 average Vermonters.
Right.
And they wanted these Vermonters on these commissions to be the fail-safe mechanism, the oversight of the bureaucrats. And so even if the developer also needs to get one of those technical permits, a person can come to Act 250, not because they feel bad about the project, but because they have information and facts. They could put it on the table, and the district commission, exercising oversight, can actually override the bureaucracy in terms
Wow.
of those technical permits. And there are, it doesn't happen a lot over the years,
Right.
but with the times it's happened, you can say, thank goodness for Act 250.
Yeah.
The most famous case was down in Pittsford, Vermont, big ski area, not a ski area, a second home development, big sewer system, and the agency told them they did not need to get what's called an indirect discharge permit, which would require much more careful review of the impact on groundwater. And Act 250 concluded, well, yes, you do need to get it, went all the way up the ladder through the courts, and the court said, yes, Act 250 was right. So there's an example. So with respect to the
Right.
landfill, there's a lot of technical permits for that landfill, and I guess looking into the future, as future applications come in for the landfill, there'll be more opportunity for public participation to shine a spotlight on very critical facts.
That's good.
Yep.
So really Act 250 is attempting to protect us, the citizens, from destroying what's
Right.
around us, because once we destroy water or sources of water,
Right.
we're in big trouble.
That's right. It's very important for people to realize that Act 250 from the get-go was designed and still is designed to be a permitting system. It's designed to issue permits. It's not designed to deny permits. Yes, permits will be issued with conditions, but it's geared up so that people will be entitled to use their land. Over the whole course of Act 250, which again has been around for 50 years now,
Okay.
less than 7% of the applications were denied.
Wow.
So it really doesn't stop growth. It really, in fact, just going on with that for a minute, people say it's bad for the economy. In fact, during a very serious recessions in the 1980s and in the 1990s, after the smoke cleared on the recession, two studies were done. One by the Federal Reserve Bank in Boston and another one by a major university. And in both of those, they concluded that Vermont withstood the recession better than all the other New England states because Act 250 prevented overbuilding.
Wow.
People may recall during those recessions, in fact, during most recessions, there's a glut usually of housing on the market. How ironic, right? Now we're
Yeah, I
still
was
searching
just
for
thinking,
affordable housing,
right.
You can't make this stuff up. But in those examples, in 1980, 1990, the proof in the pudding was Act 250 was very good for the Vermont economy, contrary to, as I said, the propaganda.
So what do we do to change that? How do people get real facts? Obviously, they can listen to you.
Yeah.
They can listen to this. But how do real people
Yeah.
blow off propaganda? And isn't this a question for life? It's
Right.
not just for Act 250.
Right.
But how do we get that out there?
Well, as I said before, increasing the ability to share information. public education is incredibly
Yeah.
important. And putting in terms of the here and now, many people believe, and there are so many studies, that with the climate crisis unfolding,
Yeah.
Vermont, actually northern New England, is going to suffer less impacts than most of the country because of terrain and so on and so forth. And the point is this, that there's going to be eventually a migration into Vermont. There's going to be a population migration
It's
into
started.
Vermont. It's starting already,
Yeah.
yes, that's absolutely correct. And so to answer your question, legislators now should be taking it by the horns and begin to talk about how do we retool Act 250 in order to prepare for that migration.
Right.
And that would open up the dialogue for Vermonters to learn more about Act 250. It's 50 years old, I've never had a 50-year-old car, but like most people, I've driven 20-year-old cars, and
I have too.
after a while, you can't fix it anymore, right?
Right.
You have to retool it. And so, particularly here in the Northeast Kingdom, this really is the jewel of Vermont. And in future years,
We
if you
think
just,
so.
that's right. If you look at it like basically supply and demand,
Right.
what we have in the Northeast Kingdom, there's only so much of it left. And a lot of future generations are going to be looking for an area like this to recreate, to
Right.
renew. And in the long term, the value of the economy in the future is to preserve that stuff. Yes, to let it develop, but develop carefully. So in a long-winded way to answer your question about how do we
Right.
get the information out, by dealing with the here and now, to have people understand what are the challenges of the future and how can we prepare for it, and here's how we improve Act 250.
Yeah, and I've recently seen some building projects, and I really don't know if Act 250 was or wasn't involved,
Right.
where the clear cutting that was done right down to the lake makes me want to go around, bang on their door and pound their heads,
Yeah.
because what are you thinking? Why are you doing this?
Mhm.
Would Act 250 be involved in something like that, or would that be just A&R?
It comes back to that word jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So why the person would be clearing the land is dependent upon what they want to do with their
They want
land.
a better view.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
better view. I mean, if I had a private piece of land and I wanted to clear cut for a view of the lake and it was just my personal house, no Act 250 whatsoever.
Yeah, even though that's environmentally harmful.
Correct.
So there are limits to where it can be applied.
Right.
Or I guess it's not limits, because it's how it was set up in the beginning. It was set up with specific purposes.
It was set up for specific purposes, but what's been happening over the years, the legislature keeps carving out more and more exemptions
Yeah.
to Act 250 jurisdiction in response to alleged horror stories of it. And so, and also for positive, hopeful positive outcomes too. For example, over the last few years, they've been carving out exceptions to Act 250 jurisdiction to increase affordable housing. They've been saying no Act 250 in the so-called downtown areas to increase affordable housing.
Right.
Great idea, right? But some of us say, hey, as you're talking about even more exemptions in this coming January 2023, does anybody ever look back to see if the previous exemptions worked?
It's a good question.
Or are we just giving more and more blank checks
Yeah.
to developers? Now, people will say, well, what's the big deal, right? If it's in downtown, the city or the town can take care of itself.
Wrong.
Right. I mean, when you really look at some of the zoning and subdivision bylaws of some of the towns, some of them are great, some of them are extremely weak.
Well, when you look at a city like Newport that is built right on the shores of a lake,
Right.
and you look at some of the big businesses that exist now, would they be allowed to set up now, knowing what they are very likely letting go into the lake?
A great question. I guess I would assume, again, since I said it's primarily designed as a permitting system,
Yeah.
there would probably be wider buffers to the lake. There would probably be more stringent control of stormwater runoff.
Yeah.
Certainly more beefed up a review of energy use, conservation, stuff like that. Case by case.
Yeah. It's not really a systemic overview, is there? Years ago, I did one of A&R's trainings. It was actually a really useful one. It was about shoreland erosion.
Right.
And what was clear was that people get permits for their own little piece, but it's never looked at in the context of the entire shoreline, for
Right.
example.
Right,
And yet that makes a difference. So I may get a permit for my piece,
right,
but if then what I'm doing is causing harm to the next piece,
yep.
that doesn't even get seen.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, that gets to the topic of cumulative impacts.
Yeah.
You know, one little thing, maybe no big deal. A bunch of little things, wow, really big
Yeah.
whammy, right? So I think the legislature's thinking over the years has been that cumulative impacts would be addressed and considered by the town.
Yeah.
And this is a little bit with rose-colored glasses on, right? I
Yeah.
mean, all of Vermont, runs on citizen volunteers for the most part.
It
And that's a
does.
strength in some ways. But on the other hand,
weakness,
it's a
too.
weakness, right? Because
Yes.
East Overshoe is different from West Overshoe in terms of the people that step up to the plate.
Right.
Some people look out for the community. Some people, quite frankly, look out for their own best interest.
Mm-hmm.
So, some town plans are very strong on a topic like you're talking about, cumulative impacts. And when you have a strong town plan, that's a building block to then improve your zoning and your subdivision regulations. But every town's different, and unfortunately, some of the towns with the most important natural resources have very weak plans and zoning.
Yeah, I mean, I know Newport is starting to look at their zoning regulations
Yes.
again.
Yep.
And I know they did a lot of work on it in the past. But if we are really going to, quote, look to the lake and focus on this area, assuming that we're going to get an influx of people over time,
Right.
and assuming little things like bandwidth and housing magically appear, then, yeah,
Yeah.
there does need to be something systemic.
Yep. Well, ideally, it's all hand in glove. The
Right.
locals do a strong local review. That would not eliminate an Act 250 review, but it would certainly make a more expedited Act 250 review.
Yeah.
Hand in glove. But again, I keep coming back to the topic of, Act 250 is designed to be the oversight,
Right.
to make sure, at the finish line of the checklist, the T's are crossed and I's are dotted, and if not, then Act 250 is supposed to step up to the plate and fill in the missing links.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you miss being a full-time bureaucrat?
I do miss working for the public interest. I really
Yeah.
do. I put in 30 years in what's called District 5,
Yeah.
which are the 35 towns in Washington County, Lamoille County, and a couple of towns out of Orange County.
Mm-hmm.
So I dealt with all of the big developments in Stowe, Sugarbush,
Wow.
shopping malls. We did a lot of what we call mining projects, gravel extraction and quarries. The glacier left the sand and gravel where it left it.
Right.
But in those rural communities, like up here in the Northeast Kingdom, right, it's extremely important for someone to represent the public interest. Yes,
Right.
the urban areas need that sand and gravel to do what they're building there, right? But the scar and the impact should not unduly burden the people in the rural communities. So I mention that because I used to do a lot of public outreach on my own when I worked for the state, which I miss probably more than anything, because it was an opportunity to work with people in all those towns and try and raise consciousness, and why it's
Right.
important for them to step up to the plate and do protection of things like gravel extraction and all. I also used to bring up the topic of subdivision of land. I remember vividly going to Waterville, town of Waterville over there
Yeah.
on the west side of Lamoille County.
Right.
At that time, it probably still has no zoning, no subdivision regs, no sewerage ordinance. And I could see, because we see more of the paperwork at the state offices, I could see that a lot of Waterville was being carved up into big lots. So, these 200, 300-acre lands that have been in the property of families for years and years, for various reasons are beginning to be carved up.
Right.
But they're being carved up into 50-acre parcels, 75-acre parcels, none of which trigger Act 250 or anything else in this local review, so you don't need anything. But what happens is those 50, 75-acre parcels then get broken up into more lots, right?
Right.
Because what was going on is that the population growth in Chittenden County was bubbling out into Lamoille County, right?
Yeah.
Because you could drive from Waterville to go to work in Chittenden County. So the point is this, I would meet with the Planning Commission in Waterville and say, it's just too bad when you look up at these beautiful mountain ridges in Waterville that no one's really up there spraying an orange surveying paint where these lots are happening now, because people are unaware of it. It's like a time bomb that's going to go
Right.
off 5, 10, 15 years down the road, and people are going to say, how did this happen? How are we going to get our hands around the impact? Well, the cow's out of the barn 15
Right.
years down the road. So to answer your question in a long-winded way, what I miss a lot of is that dynamic of working with people. I worked with a lot of folks that would have a farm, and they'd have either a child or a grandchild that was going to go to college. They needed some extra money for that. They'd open up a small gravel pit on their property. I saw my responsibility to work with those people to make it a user-friendly process.
Right.
So, yeah, I do miss that part of it.
Huh.
I do not miss, being portrayed as the Mr. No Growth. I can't tell you how many times I would be summoned to the vice principal's office, i.e. the legislature,
Right.
for being no growth, which
Yeah.
wasn't true.
I can imagine that you don't miss that. But again, the legislature needs the education, and when I've gone to the state building, the place is crawling with lobbyists.
Oh, yes.
So you know that the education
Right.
is mostly coming from, quote, the other side.
Right.
And their interests are very different.
This is a very important point, not only for Act 250, for other topics,
Yes.
too, in Vermont, because
Certainly is.
even if you hear that the lobbyists were there saying something about either Act 250 or whatever your interest is, well, you're not there the same day. You might not find out for 2 weeks. And once
Right.
these seeds get planted in legislators'
Right.
minds, it's very difficult to unplant those seeds.
It certainly is. And many of us have tried.
Yes,
But we can't even begin to compete with that.
right.
We recently, about a year ago, I guess, went to a hearing in Concord just to observe.
Yes.
And we don't live in New Hampshire, so I really didn't have a dog in that race.
Yeah.
But it was just a small piece of decision making. There were about 6 people on one side of the room, and the other side of the room was packed. It was sort of like the bride and groom's side, and I don't know which side was on that side, but it was packed.
Yeah.
And the person I was sitting next to said, "That's a lobbyist, that's a lobbyist, that's a lobbyist." They were all lobbyists.
Yep.
They were being paid to be there,
Right.
and they were being paid there to support
Right.
whatever the position was they were there supporting.
Right.
And I've had that experience in Montpelier and
Right.
elsewhere. It's very hard to get beyond that.
Right. It's easier said than done. The Vermont legislature still remains very accessible
Yes, it
to
does.
average person.
Yeah.
However, not that easy to get down there. And also, a lot of people, unfortunately, have this built-in mindset where they've just been led to believe government is bad all the time, right? Not realizing that government can be working to your advantage.
Yes.
Regulation is terrible. Well, regulation is important to protect your best interest.
Right.
Water, clean air.
Mm-hmm.
Now, back to what I said before about climate migration into Vermont, several of us have the serious concern that the lands above 1,500 feet in elevation are the most important lands to preserve.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say nothing ever happens on these lands,
Right.
but whatever's going to happen there has to happen carefully. Why do I say lands above 1,500 feet? That's where the aquifers are for all of our drinking water in Vermont.
Yes.
How many people depend on wells, right? Above 1,500 feet is where all the headwaters are of the rivers and streams.
Mm-hmm.
We do know, the scientists are telling us, for those that like to hunt, wildlife are migrating to the higher elevations to survive. That's where the
Right.
habitat areas of the future are going to be. All of those forested areas are huge, what are called carbon sinks.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, there are studies now showing that what's called the Great Northern Forest. The Great Northern Forest is the remaining forest in Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and Quebec may be equally as important as the Amazon as the so-called lungs of the planet.
Right.
So, we have a responsibility to future generations of Vermonters
Yes,
to
we do.
protect these lands. And so, again, back to public education, back to the legislature, back to the Northeast Kingdom. It's so important for the people up here to understand what is at risk for them and for their children and grandchildren.
And how do we get access to providing that education? And do you raise your hand and say to the school, "Can I come in and talk about this?" knowing that the school board is
Right.
then probably going to flip out because they think that we're critical race theory or something else that they're supposed to bang their heads about.
Yeah.
It's really a challenge.
Extreme challenge. I think the work that you do with a public access program like this
Yeah.
is so important. I think on the college level, the Johnson State College,
Yeah.
public colleges are an important tool. Although that's becoming extremely difficult, because even their curriculum is becoming more rigid.
Yes.
I used to go and speak a lot about Act 250 and stuff like that to the colleges, but even towards the end of my state career, that was being pared down. This is a big question, how do people find out what's going on so they can become
Right.
involved?
Newport has worked an arrangement with the landfill that they go into schools.
Mm-hmm.
So they're greenwashing, in
Right.
my less than humble opinion,
Yeah.
clearly.
Right.
And yet we don't have access to go in to present a different viewpoint. And it is important, I agree, to go in and talk about recycling, how to recycle, but we're also educating young people to think of corporations as saving the planet.
Right.
Well, their interests are certainly more diverse than
Right.
the rest of us.
Right. Well, I guess we could always hope, when I was that age too, you tend to rebel and ricochet in the other direction.
I hope so.
So if they're being, in your example, fed all the information from this one perspective, maybe the kids, but from a positive point of view, you bring up such an important point. There should be a way for another point of view for the children to hear that.
Yes.
And to understand there's many ways of looking through that prism, through that kaleidoscope, and seeing different perspectives.
Yeah, and there seem to be a lot less, quote, field trips now than there
Mhm.
used to be.
Yep.
Back in my day, 100 years ago, far, far away, we went out and did things on the land. I grew up in a rural area.
Yeah.
But I don't see kids getting that opportunity in the same way.
No, you're so right about that. In fact, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Luddite when it comes to technology.
Right.
But more and more, it's all virtual learning.
Yeah.
We see more and more that via the smartphone or the what are those gizmos that some of the kids now look through, right?
Yeah.
The alternate reality
Right.
separates them from the reality.
Yes.
And so you bring up an important point. If I was growing up in Newport or Coventry, it'd be really important for me to realize what's happening with the state's only landfill.
Right.
What are they going to be? What are the impacts of that landfill on Lake Memphremagog?
Exactly. We can see the mountain, but what does that actually mean?
That's right. It's a great teaching opportunity for
Yes.
these kids, right? The teachers don't
You
have to
would
take a
think.
side. The teachers could set it up, or the school boards who do the curriculum could set up the curriculum in such a way that the kids are given both perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds to me like they're getting either no perspective or only
Right.
one perspective right
Right.
now. But that's not easy. That's easier said than done.
I know.
A long time ago, I was on the school board in Barry City where I live because my wife and I decided, well, we wanted our kids to get a good education. The way to do that is put your shoulder to the wheel and raise the quality for all the kids, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And again, I mentioned I used to teach high school a long time ago, so I
Yeah.
thought I'd really get into curriculum. Much easier said than done. I realized foolishly that many of the members of the school board thought they were really on the property tax board. That's all they talked about was property tax. We very rarely got into curriculum, and I think that's true for most
Yeah.
school boards, unfortunately, throughout the state. So the curriculum suffers as a result of that.
Right. And now there's a preponderance certainly in some areas of remote learning.
Right. Absolutely.
I would have hated to have had my college education virtually.
Yeah. Oh, me too.
I mean,
Absolutely.
where is the social connection, which in my model of the world is a really important
Yeah.
one?
I used to love having interns when I worked for the state.
Right.
I would always welcome interns, not only from the colleges, but also sometimes the high school kid would come in.
Yes.
And, they couldn't do, official stuff, but it was such a great learning opportunity to sit down with them. They learned how to read maps. They would learn, some of them went on to law school as a result of that. Some went to
Right.
engineering. I'm a big believer in what's called experiential learning. Yes, book learning is important, but learning through experience is
Right.
even more important.
when I was a social work student, again, a million years ago, we did a very short internship with a profession we would never normally have come into that kind of contact with, other than adversarially.
Yeah.
So I spent a week with cops, police. What an eye-opener. Obviously, I'd had a lot of connection with police, but from a very different perspective. To actually be going out on calls with the police was a very different experience.
I bet it was. Wow.
It was an experience that I value. I mean, it certainly made me look at things in a different way. Not necessarily seeing sort of the right and wrong, but knowing there were other ways of handling it as well. But just seeing what they have to deal with on a daily basis.
Yeah, I used to fool around with some of the kids. Well, everybody's a kid now compared to me, right?
Yeah,
but,
that's true.
But when I used to interact with some of the high school students and they knew of such and such a big project in the community, I used to kid around with them. I used to make them deputy Act 250 coordinators.
Great.
You know, and that's good because they would watch out for the impacts in their own community, stepping up to the plate.
Exactly.
And that's the way it should be. You know, all these permit processes do allow and do encourage public to call up with what they perceive as violations. It actually is part of the law in Vermont. Nobody's aware of that, though.
Right. No, that's great.
Yeah.
Is there a way that you could do that again?
Everybody's deputized.
Yeah. Well, teach them what it means. I mean, we do need ways of educating in a much broader sense, because what happens with education now, as you've pointed out, is it becomes narrower and narrower.
Oh, again, it's so important for future generations because all these finite natural resources, finite means when it's gone, it's gone.
It's gone.
It's gone permanently, right? And I often look back as a baby boomer and wonder, what are they going to say about us, you know, as the generation that had a chance to have our eyes open and to maybe make a difference.
Right.
And there is an obligation, there is a responsibility to the community to do that.
I agree. And some of us retained our activist principles, and some of us clearly didn't.
Right.
And I don't know what made the difference.
Right.
So we need to figure out ways of reactivating the activists.
Absolutely. Right.
And on that note, we have to stop.
Okay. Well, this has been wonderful.
It was
Thank you for
great.
having me.
It was a lot of fun.
Yes.
So hopefully we'll do it again in some other form with some other really important piece of information.
That would be great. Maybe we could do show and tell sometime.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.